At the beginning of 1944, Nazi Germany's fundamental problem was that it had conquered more territory than it could defend. Hitler, with a conqueror's mentality, insisted on defending every inch of occupied soil. To carry out such orders, the Wehrmacht relied on improvisations, including conscripted foreign troops, school-aged German youths, old men, and fixed defensive positions. It also changed its tactical doctrine and weapons design, transforming itself from the highly mobile Blitzkrieg army of 1941, which featured light, fast tanks and hard-marching infantry, into the ponderous, almost immobile army of 1944, which featured heavy, slow tanks and dug-in infantry. Like everything else in Nazi Germany, this transformation was Hitler's doing. He had learned from World War I that Germany could not win a war of attrition, and his policy in the first 2 years of World War II had been blitzkrieg. However, in the late fall of 1941, his lightning war broke out in Russia. Hitler then made one of his many incomprehensible mistakes by declaring war on the United States in the same week that the Red Army launched its counter-offensive outside Moscow. In the summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht attempted blitzkrieg against the Red Army again, but on a much reduced scale. One army group on one front rather than 3 army groups on 3 fronts. This attempt also failed as the snow began to fall at the end of January 1943. Nearly 250,000 German troops at Stalingrad surrendered. In July 1943, the Wehrmacht launched its last offensive on the Eastern Front at Kursk, but the Red Army stopped it cold, inflicting horrendous casualties. From Kursk onwards, Hitler had no hope of winning a military victory against the Soviet Union. However, his cause was not entirely hopeless. He had space to trade for time on the Eastern Front, and it was inevitable that the strange alliance of Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, an alliance only he could have brought together, would eventually split. Hitler hoped to benefit from this split before it occurred, believing that if he could convince Stalin that he could not depend on the United States and Britain, Stalin might conclude that the cost of victory to the Red Army fighting alone was too high. Once the Red Army had returned to the starting line of June 1941, occupying eastern Poland, Stalin might be willing to negotiate a peace based on a division of Eastern Europe between the Nazis and Soviets. Between August 1939 and June 1941, the Nazi and Soviet empires had been partners in an alliance based on a division of Eastern Europe between them. To return to that situation, Hitler had to persuade Stalin that the Wehrmacht was still capable of inflicting unacceptable casualties on the Red Army. To achieve this, Hitler needed more fighting men and machines. To get them, he had to strip his Western Front. He needed to hurl the forthcoming invasion back into the sea, which is why D-Day was critical. In a November 3, 1943, Führer Directive No. 51, Hitler explained with crystal clarity, "For the last 2.5 years, the bitter and costly struggle against Bolshevism has made the utmost demands upon the bulk of our military resources and energies. The situation has since changed. The threat from the east remains, but an even greater danger looms in the west. The Anglo-American landing in the east, the vastness of the space will, as a last resort, permit a loss of territory even on a major scale without suffering a mortal blow to Germany's chance for survival. Not so in the west. If the enemy here succeeds in penetrating our defences on a wide front, consequences of staggering proportions will follow within a short time." What he meant was that a successful Anglo-American offensive in 1944 would pose a direct threat to Germany's industrial heartland. The Rhineland region and southeastern England were closer to Cologne, Dortmund, and Essen than they were to Berlin. In other words, in the fall of 1943, the front line in the east was more than 2,000 kilometres from Berlin, while in the west it was 500 kilometres from the Rhineland and 1,000 kilometres from Berlin. A successful 1944 Red Army offensive would overrun parts of Ukraine and White Russia, areas important but not critical to Germany's war-making capability. Conversely, a successful 1944 Anglo-American offensive would overrun the Rhineland, areas indispensable to Germany's war-making capability. Thus, Hitler declared that the decisive battle would be fought on the French coast. For that reason, he could no longer justify the further weakening of the West in favour of other theatres of war. He decided to strengthen the defences in the West. This reversed a policy established in the fall of 1940, with the abandonment of preparations for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of England. Since that time, the Wehrmacht had stripped down its forces in France, transferring men and equipment to the Eastern Front on an ever-increasing scale. Hitler's reasons for shifting priority to the West in 1944 were more political than military. On March 20, 1944, he told his principal commanders in the West, "The destruction of the enemy's landing attempt means more than a purely local decision on the Western Front. It is the sole decisive factor in the whole conduct of the war, and hence in its final result." He went on to explain that once defeated, the enemy would never again try to invade. Apart from their heavy losses, they would need months to organise a fresh attempt. An invasion failure would also deliver a crushing blow to British and American morale. For one thing, it would prevent Roosevelt from being re-elected, and with any luck, he'd end up in jail. For another, war weariness would grip Britain even faster, and Churchill, already a sick old man with his influence waning, wouldn't be able to carry out a new invasion operation. At that point, the Wehrmacht could transfer 45 divisions from the west to the east, revolutionizing the situation there. So the whole outcome of the war depended on each man fighting in the west, which meant the fate of the Reich as well. This was Germany's only hope. More correctly, it was Hitler's and the Nazis' only hope for the German people and nation. The decision to continue the struggle spelled catastrophe. In any case, had Hitler's scenario played out, in the summer of 1945, the US Army Air Force, secure in its bases in England, would have started dropping atomic bombs on Berlin and other German cities. But of course, in early 1944, no one knew when or even if the American Manhattan Project would be able to produce such a bomb. Hitler's problem was not his priorities, but how to hurl the coming invasion back into the sea. That problem was compounded by many factors summed up in one word: shortages. Shortages of ships, planes, men, and guns. Germany was overextended far worse than she had been in World War I. Hitler had criticized the Kaiser for getting into a two-front war, but at the end of 1943, Hitler was fighting a three-front war. On the Eastern Front, his troops were stretched over more than 2,000 kilometers. On the Mediterranean front, which ran from southern Greece through Yugoslavia, across Italy and southern France, his troops were defending a line of some 3,000 kilometers. On the Western Front, his troops were called on to defend 6,000 kilometers of coastline, running from Holland to the southern end of the Bay of Biscay. Actually, there was a fourth front at home. The Allied air offensive against German cities had driven the Luftwaffe out of France, forcing it to fight over German skies to defend German cities. The bombing had not had a decisive effect on German war production, not even close, as Germany was increasing its output of tanks and guns through 1943, although not fast enough to make up the losses. But it had put the Luftwaffe on the defensive. Hitler hated that. Everything in his own psychology, everything in German military tradition, cried out for taking the offensive. But Hitler could not attack his enemies, at least not until his secret weapons came online. It was gall and wormwood to him, but he had to stay on the defensive. That necessity so stuck in his craw that it led him to make strategic and technological blunders of the greatest magnitude. When German physicists told him in 1940 that it might be possible to build an atomic bomb by 1945, he ordered them to abandon the project on the grounds that by then the war would have been won or lost. That was almost certainly a wise decision, not because his prediction was accurate, but because Germany did not have the industrial or natural resources to produce an atomic bomb. German scientists went to work instead on other weapons, at Hitler's insistence. These were offensive weapons, such as diesel submarines, pilotless aircraft, and rockets. The Vergeltungswaffen, vengeance weapons, were designed and used eventually, but in no way were they decisive. The V-2, the world's first medium-range ballistic missile, was not a military weapon at all, but a terrorist device. The Scud missiles used by Iraq in 1991 in the Gulf War were only slightly improved versions of the V-2. Like the V-2, they were inaccurate and carried only a small explosive load. Hitler's passion for bombing London and his indifference to defending German cities led to a monstrous, history-changing misjudgment. In May 1943, Professor Willy Messerschmitt had a Me-262 twin-jet fighter ready for serial production. Its cruise speed was 520 mph, more than 120 miles per hour, faster than any plane the Allies could send against it, and it mounted 4 X-30mm cannons. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring wanted the plane, but he had to clear it with Hitler. Hitler had been burned by Göring's promises too many times, and not until December 1943 did Hitler witness a demonstration of the 262's capabilities. Hitler was impressed, but wanted a bomber to hit London, not a fighter to defend Germany. Göring assured him that the 262 could be modified to carry bombs, whereupon Hitler went into great raptures about what the jet bomber would do to London and the anticipated Allied landings in France. Göring typically did not know what he was talking about. Messerschmitt could not make a fighter into a bomber, and a larger jet airplane was pushing the technology too hard. So he ignored Hitler's order, and Messerschmitt's works started turning out 262s, a total of about 120 by April 1944. When Hitler got this news, he braced Göring and gave him strict orders that not only was the 262 not to be built as a fighter, but that nobody should even refer to it as a fighter. It was to be known as the Blitz bomber. For the next 6 months, Messerschmitt tried manfully to make a bomber out of a fighter, but he got nowhere. Finally, in November 1944, Hitler authorized the formation of the first jet fighter wing. By then, the transportation system was in shambles, the fighter pilot force was decimated, and the fuel sources were all but dried up. The Luftwaffe never got more than a token force into the air before things fell apart. The Germans built more than 1,000 Me-262s, but only in the last 6 weeks of the war did they get as many as 100 in the air at one time. However, as a secret report in 1960 to President Dwight Eisenhower pointed out, during that time the Germans literally flew around our fighters and bored holes in our bomber formations with complete impunity. For example, 14 fighter groups escorted the 1-250 B-17 raid on Berlin, March 18, 1945, almost a 1-to-1 escort ratio. They were set upon by a single squadron of Me-262s, which knocked down 25 bombers and 5 fighters. Although outnumbered roughly 100-to-1, the Germans lost not a single plane. The report, which Eisenhower had asked to be prepared for his personal use only, was written by White House staff officer Ralph Williams. He said he had talked to General Karl Spaatz, commander of the 8th Air Force in World War II. Spaatz freely conceded that none of our fighters was any match for the German jets, and added that if the Germans had been able to deploy them in force to the French coast, they could have denied US air superiority, frustrated the Normandy landings, and might even have compelled us to work our way up into Europe via the Italian route. But what might have been wasn't there. There were no German jets over France or the English Channel in June 1944, and precious few propeller airplanes. There were also precious few ships of war, and those that were present were E-boats, an oversized German version of the American patrol boat PT boat, almost as big as a destroyer escort. The E stood for enemy. They were capable of laying mines, firing torpedoes, and running away at high speed. Other than the E-boats, the only contribution the German Navy could make to the defence of Fortress Europe was mine-laying. With no air force and no navy, the German defenders of Fortress Europe were blind and forced to stretch out to cover every conceivable landing site. Control of the air and sea gave the Allies unprecedented mobility and almost certain surprise. In briefest form, they would know where and when the battle would be fought, and the Germans would not. In World War I, preparations for a massive offensive could not be hidden. The build-up of troops took weeks, and the artillery preparation took days. By the time the offensive began, the defenders knew where and when it would hit and could strengthen their positions at the point of attack. But in the spring of 1944, the Germans could only guess. Hitler's spiritual mentor, Frederick the Great, had warned, "He who defends everything defends nothing." It was the human and material wastage of the war on the Eastern Front that forced Hitler to ignore Frederick's warning and adopt a policy on the Western Front of fixed fortifications. Wehrmacht losses had been staggering. In June 1941, the Wehrmacht entered Russia with 3.3 million men. By the end of 1943, it had suffered nearly 3 million casualties, about one-third of which were permanent, killed, missing, captured, or unfit for combat due to wounds. Despite heroic efforts to make up the deficit by drawing down in France and calling up fresh conscripts from within Germany, after the Battle of Kursk, next to Verdun, the greatest battle ever fought with more than 2 million men engaged, the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front was down to 2.5 million, attempting to hold a line that stretched from Leningrad in the north to the Black Sea. In the south, nearly 2,000 kilometers from the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht initially prided itself on its racial purity. However, the desperate need for replacements forced it to drastically modify and eventually abandon that policy. Initially, so-called Volksdeutsche, racial Germans, from Poland and the Balkan countries were required to volunteer. They were classified as Apt.3, Section 3, on the German racial list. This meant they were vested with German citizenship for a probationary period of 10 years, and were liable for military service but could not rise above the rank of private first class. By 1942–43, recruiting in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union was aggressively pursued for the struggle against communism. Initially, there was some truth to the designation of these recruits as Freiwilligen, volunteers, as men from the Western republics of the Soviet Empire signed up for the fight against Stalin. When the German retreat began, there were fewer Freiwilligen and more Hilfswillige auxiliaries, conscripted from the occupied territories and from Red Army prisoners of war. By the beginning of 1944, the Wehrmacht had volunteers from France, Italy, Croatia, Hungary, Romania, Poland, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Asia, Russia, North Africa, Ukraine, Ruthenia, the Muslim republics of the Soviet Union, as well as Volga Tatars, Volga Finns, Crimean Tatars, and even Indians. The so-called OST East battalions became increasingly unreliable after the German defeat at Stalingrad. They were therefore sent to France in exchange for German troops. At the beach called Utah on the day of the invasion, Lieutenant Robert Brewer of the 56th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, U.S. Army, captured 4 Asians in Wehrmacht uniforms. No one could speak their language. Eventually, it was learned that they were Koreans. How on earth did Koreans end up fighting for Hitler to defend France against Americans? It seems they had been conscripted into the Japanese army in 1938. Korea was then a Japanese colony. Captured by the Red Army in the border battles with Japan in 1939, they were forced into the Red Army, captured by the Wehrmacht in December 1941 outside Moscow, and then forced into the German army and sent to France. What happened to them, Lieutenant Brewer never found out, but presumably they were sent back to Korea. If so, they would almost certainly have been conscripted again, either into the South or the North Korean army. It is possible that in 1950 they ended up fighting once again, either against the US Army or with it, depending on which part of Korea they came from. Such are the vagaries of politics in the 20th century. By June 1944, 1 in 6 German riflemen in France was from an OST battalion. Furthermore, the Wehrmacht sharply relaxed its physical standards to bring more genuine Germans into the line. Men with stomach and lung ailments were sent to the front. Convalescence time was cut, as was training time for recruits. Younger and older men were called up. Of an army of 4,270,000 men in December 1943, more than 1.5 million were over 34 years old. In the 79th Division on the Kenton Peninsula, the average age was 36. In the Wehrmacht as a whole, the average age was 31, whereas in the US Army, the average age was 25. Meanwhile, while the classes of 1925 and 1926 were called up as a consequence of these desperate measures, the Wehrmacht did not have the resources to conduct a defence in depth based on counterattacks and counteroffensives. It lacked sufficient high-quality troops, mobility and armour. The old men, boys and foreign troops were of value only if they were put into trenches or cement fortifications with German NCOs standing behind them, pistol in hand, ready to shoot any man who left his post. In 1939, Hitler had characterized the Wehrmacht as an army such as the world has never seen. It was far from that. At the end of 1943, the US War Department described the German soldier as one of several different types. The veteran of many fronts and many retreats is a prematurely aged, war-weary cynic, either discouraged and disillusioned or too stupefied to have any thought of his own. Yet he is a seasoned campaigner, most likely a non-commissioned officer, and performs his duties with the highest degree of efficiency. The new recruit, except in some crack SS units or protection detachments, is either too young or too old, and often in poor health. He has been poorly trained for lack of time, but if too young he makes up for this with fanaticism bordering on madness. If too old, he is driven by the fear of what his propagandists have told him will happen to the fatherland in case of an Allied victory, and even more by the fear of what he has been told will happen to him and his family if he does not carry out orders exactly as given. Thus even the old and sick perform to a certain point with the courage of despair. The German High Command has been particularly successful in placing the various types of men where they best fit, and in selecting those to serve as cannon fodder, who are told to hold out to the last man while every effort is made to preserve the elite units, which are now almost entirely part of the Waffen-SS. The German soldier in these units is in a preferred category and is the backbone of the German armed forces. He is pledged never to surrender and has no moral code except allegiance to his organization. There is no limit to his ruthlessness. Beyond the Waffen-SS, the best of the young recruits went into the Fallschirmjäger, Paratroop, or Panzer armoured units. These elite troops had been carefully brought up in Nazi Germany for this challenge. Born between 1920 and 1925, they had grown up in Hitler's Germany, subject to constant and massive propaganda, members of the Nazi youth, and equipped with the best Germany could produce, which in small arms, armoured vehicles and artillery, was among the best in the world. They made first-class fighting outfits. In naturally strong coastal defences, made stronger by the skill of German engineers, even second- and third-class troops could inflict heavy casualties on an attacking force. Hitler roundly declared that it was a soldier's duty to stand and die in his defences. That was a World War I mentality, a far cry from blitzkrieg and inappropriate to the age of tanks and other armoured vehicles. But given the situation, it was inevitable. What gave the concept some believability was the plan to use the crack Waffen-SS paratroops and armoured troops in an immediate counterattack. At the end of 1943, those troops and tanks were still on the Eastern Front or forming up inside Germany. But Hitler's directive of November 3, 1943, meant that many of them, perhaps enough, would be standing just behind the Atlantic Wall when the assault began. As early as March 1942, Hitler laid down the basic principle in Directive No. 40. He ordered that the Atlantic coast defences should be so organised and troops so deployed that any invasion attempt be smashed before the landing or immediately thereafter. In August 1942, he decreed that fortress construction in France proceed with fanatic energy to create a continuous belt of interlocking fire emanating from bomb-proof concrete structures. In the words of the official American historian Gordon Harrison, Hitler was not then and never would be convinced that defense could not be made invulnerable if enough concrete and resolution could be poured into it. In September 1942, at a 3-hour conference with Reich Minister Albert Speer, Chief of Organisation Todt, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander in the West, General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff OB West and others, Hitler reiterated his orders to prepare the strongest possible fortifications along the Atlantic Wall. They must be built, he said, on the assumption that the Anglo-Americans would enjoy air and naval supremacy. Only concrete could stand up to the crushing weight of bombs and shells. He therefore wanted 15,000 concrete strongpoints to be occupied by 300,000 men. As no portion of the coast was safe, the whole would have to be walled up. He wanted the fortifications completed by May 1st, 1943. Most of this was pure fantasy, and aside from the top priority positions, almost none of it was accomplished by the end of 1943. But the policy had been set and the commitment made. Rundstedt was unhappy with the idea of fixed fortifications. He argued that the Germans should hold their armoured units well back from the coast, out of range of Allied naval gunfire, capable of mounting a genuine counter-offensive. But shortages of armour, men, fuel and air coverage made that questionable. What Hitler could do was attempt to anticipate the landing site, keep what armour was available for the west near that place, and use it for local counterattacks while the Atlantic Wall held up the invaders. Tanks could seal off any penetration and drive the lightly armed and unarmoured first wave of invaders back into the sea. If the fortifications were strong enough to keep the Allies from establishing momentum, the trick was to pick the place to make the fortifications strong. The Pas-de-Calais was the logical place for the invasion for two overwhelming reasons. Between Dover and Calais is where the English Channel is narrowest, and the straight line from London to the Rhine and on to Berlin runs through London, Dover, Calais and Belgium. Hitler had to make a bet, and in 1943 he bet the invasion would come at the Pas-de-Calais. In a way, he tried to force the Allies to invade there. In the summer of 1943, he decided to install the launching sites for the V-1 and V-2 rockets in that area. He believed that whatever the Allies' previous plans might have been, the V-weapons would be so dangerous as to force them to attack directly in the Pas-de-Calais in order to overrun the launching sites. Thus, the area around Calais became by far the strongest fortified portion of the Channel coast, and in 1944 the location of by far the greatest concentration of German armour in the West. It was there that the Atlantic Wall came closest to what German propaganda claimed it was, an impregnable fortress. He was a strange man, the German Führer. In the view of the Deputy Chief of Operations at OB Kommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, General Walter Warlimont, he knew the location of the defences in detail better than any single army officer. Hitler's passion for detail was astonishing. On one occasion, he pointed out that there were 2 fewer anti-aircraft guns on the Channel Islands than had been there the previous week. The officer responsible for this supposed reduction was punished. It turned out to have been a miscount. Hitler spent hours studying the maps showing German installations along the Atlantic Wall. He demanded reports on building progress, the thickness of the concrete, the kind of concrete used, and the system used to put in the steel reinforcement. These reports often ran to more than 10 pages. But after ordering the creation of the greatest fortification in history, he never bothered to inspect any part of it. After leaving Paris in triumph in the summer of 1940, he did not set foot on French soil again until mid-June 1944. Yet he declared this was the decisive theatre. The Allied problem was to land, penetrate the Atlantic Wall, and secure a lodgment in an area suitable for reinforcement and expansion. The sine qua non of the operation was to achieve surprise. If the Germans knew where and when the attack was coming, they could surely concentrate enough men, concrete, tanks and artillery at the spot to defeat the assault. It was going to be difficult enough even with surprise. Amphibious operations are inherently the most complicated in war. Few have ever been successful. Julius Caesar and William the Conqueror had managed it, but nearly every other invasion attempted against organised opposition had failed. Napoleon had not been able to cross the English Channel, nor had Hitler. The Mongols were defeated by the weather when they tried to invade Japan, as were the Spanish when they tried to invade England. The British were frustrated in the Crimea in the 19th century and defeated at Gallipoli in World War I. The record of the Allies improved by World War II. By the end of 1943, the Allies had launched 3 successful amphibious attacks: North Africa, November 8, 1942, Sicily, July 10, 1943, and Salerno, September 9, 1943. These operations involved British and American land, sea and air forces under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. None of the coastlines had been fortified. The only attack against a fortified coast by the Canadians at Dieppe in northern France in August 1942 had been decisively defeated. In North Africa, the Allies achieved surprise by attacking a French colonial army without a declaration of war. Yet they encountered many difficulties. In Sicily, the opposition was mainly dispirited Italian troops, but there were some significant mishaps, including the shooting down by Allied naval craft of Allied transport planes carrying the U.S. 82nd Airborne Division. At Salerno, the Germans quickly recovered from the twin surprises of the Italian double cross and the seaborne landings, and came close to driving the Anglo-American troops back into the sea, despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Going into 1944, there was little in the way of precedent or historic example for the Allies to look to for inspiration. What they were about to attempt had not been done before, but it had to be done. U.S. Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall had wanted to invade France in late 1942, and even more so in mid-1943. British hesitation and political necessity had forced a diversion to the Mediterranean. By the end of 1943, however, the British overcame their doubts, and the Allies committed to a cross-channel attack as the decisive effort for 1944. The overriding reason for this decision was the obvious point that wars are won by offensive action. For all his hesitation about when the offensive should begin, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill always knew it must happen. As early as October 1941, he had told Captain Lord Louis Mountbatten, head of Combined Operations, to prepare for the invasion of Europe, stating that unless they could land and fight Hitler on land, they would never win the war. To this end, Marshall had transformed the U.S. Army from a cadre of 170,000 men in 1940 to an army of 7.2 million by 1943, with 2.3 million in the Army Air Force. This was the best equipped, most mobile and powerful army on earth. Using this army only in Italy was unacceptable. Failure to mount an assault to create a second front would be a double cross to Stalin, and might lead to precisely the political consequence Hitler was counting on: a separate Nazi-Soviet armistice, or perhaps worse, a Red Army liberation and subsequent occupation of Western Europe. At a minimum, no cross-channel attack in 1944 would delay victory against the Nazis until late 1945, possibly 1946. Meanwhile, the political pressure to tell the British, "To hell with it, if you won't fight in France, we will take our army to the Pacific," would become irresistible. There had to be an assault. Despite the difficulties and German advantages, land lines of communication, fighting on the defensive, and fixed fortifications, the Allies had a decisive edge thanks to their control of the sea and air and the mass production of landing craft. The Allies had unprecedented mobility and could choose the time and place of the battle. Once the battle began, however, the advantage would shift to the Germans. Once in France, the Allied paratroops and seaborne troops would be relatively immobile until the beachhead had been expanded to allow self-propelled artillery and trucks to come ashore. Movement would be by legs rather than half-tracks or tyres. The Germans, meanwhile, could move to the sound of the guns by road and rail. By spring 1944, they would have 50 infantry and 11 armoured divisions in France. The Allies could hardly hope to put more than 5 divisions into the attack on the first day, enough to give them local superiority, but all reinforcements, bullets, bandages and K-rations would have to cross the English Channel to get into the battle. The Allies faced 2 main problems: getting ashore and winning the battle of the build-up. Once a secure beachhead was established and there was room to deploy inland, the weapons produced in massive quantities in the United States could be brought into France, sealing the German fate. The question then would be when and at what cost unconditional surrender would be achieved. If the Germans could bring 10 divisions of infantry and armour into the battle by the end of the first week to launch a coordinated counterattack, their local manpower and firepower advantages could be decisive. Long-term, the Allied problem appeared even greater. There would be over 60 German divisions in France in the spring of 1944, while the Allies would need 7 weeks after D-Day to complete the commitment of the 40-odd divisions they would gather in Britain. The Allies could count on their vast air fleets to hamper German movement, but interdiction would be effective only in daylight and good weather. Far more effective would be to immobilize the panzer divisions through trickery, fooling the Germans not only in advance of the attack, but making them believe that the real attack was a feint. Selecting the invasion site was crucial. Whatever site was selected, the assault would be a direct frontal attack against prepared positions. How to do that successfully at an acceptable cost was a problem that had stumped generals on all sides between 1914 and 1918 and had not been solved by the end of 1943. The Wehrmacht had outflanked and outmaneuvered its opponents in Poland in 1939, in France in 1940, and in Russia in 1941. Direct frontal attacks by the Red Army against the Wehrmacht in 1943 and by the British and Americans in Italy that same year had been costly and relatively ineffective. The frontal attack on D-Day would be from sea to land. In World War I, all frontal attacks had been preceded by tremendous artillery bombardments, sometimes lasting a week or more. Thanks to their enormous fleet, the Allies had the firepower to duplicate such artillery preparation. However, Allied planners decided that surprise was more important than a lengthy bombardment, so they limited the pre-assault bombardment to a half-hour or so. Later, critics charged that the heavy losses suffered at Omaha Beach would have been less had there been a pre-invasion air and sea bombardment lasting several days, as was done later in the Pacific at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. What the criticism missed was the central point. As Samuel Eliot Morison wrote in his official history of the U.S. Navy, the Allies were invading a continent where the enemy had immense capabilities for reinforcement and counterattack, not a small island cut off by sea power from sources of supply. Even a complete pulverizing of the Atlantic Wall at Omaha Beach would have been useless if the German command had been given 24 hours' notice to move up reserves for a counterattack. The Allies had to accept the risk of heavy casualties on the beaches to prevent far heavier ones on the plateau and among the hedgerows. In World War I, when the artillery barrage lifted, the infantry would climb out of the trenches and attempt to cross no man's land. In an amphibious assault, the attacking infantry would not jump off trenches close to the enemy line. Rather, they would struggle up out of the water and across wet sand, which would hamper their equipment and agility. How they would get from transport ships suitable for bringing them across the channel to the shore was uncertain at the beginning of World War II. In the late 1930s, the U.S. Marines, anticipating a war against Japan in the Pacific that would involve island attacks, had pressed the Navy to build landing craft. However, the Navy was more interested in aircraft carriers and battleships than in small boats, so little was done. The Wehrmacht had planned to cross the Channel to attack England in 1940, using towed barges to transport its infantry assault units. These barges, built for Europe's canal and river systems, would have been worse than useless in the open channel with anything other than an absolute calm. The British began developing a solution in 1941 with the landing ship tank, LST, and the landing craft tank, LCT. The last was a large ship, as big as a light cruiser, 327 feet long, displacing 4,000 tons. But it was flat-bottomed and thus hard to control in any kind of sea. It could ground and discharge tanks or trucks on shallow gradient beaches. When it beached, 2 bow doors opened to the sides, and a ramp was lowered to allow vehicles to drive ashore. It could carry dozens of tanks and trucks in its cavernous hold, along with small landing craft on its deck. The LCT, in US Navy parlance, was over 200 feet in length. A craft less than that was a flat-bottomed craft, 110 feet long, capable of carrying from 4 to 8 tanks. There were eventually 4 types of LCTs. Across relatively wide bodies of water, such as the Channel, even in rough seas, it could discharge its cargo over a ramp. When America entered the war, it took on the task of all LST and most LCT production, considerably improving the design. The LSTs and LCTs became the workhorses of the Allies. They were the basic vehicle-carrying landing craft used successfully in the Mediterranean in 1942 and 1943. However, they had significant shortcomings. They were slow, cumbersome, and easy targets. Those who sailed LSTs insisted the initials stood for Long Slow Target. They were not suitable for landing platoons of fighting men, the skirmishers who would have to lead the way in the first wave. For that job, a small boat of shallow draft with a protected propeller, capable of quickly extracting itself by the bow and having a small turning circle, was needed. It would also require a ramp so that the rifleman could move onto the beach quickly rather than jumping over the sides. Various designers in America, both in and out of the Navy, addressed the problem, coming up with a variety of solutions. Some of these worked well, but the best were the Landing Craft Infantry, LCI, a seagoing troop landing craft of 160 feet in length, capable of carrying a reinforced company of infantry, nearly 200 men, and discharging them down ramps on each side of the bow, the Landing Craft Medium, LCM, and the Landing Craft Vehicle and Personnel, LCVP. There were also many other types, including the oddest of all, a floating 212-ton truck. This vehicle, designed by civilian employee Palmer C. Putnam at the Office of Scientific Research and Development, was a hybrid that turned a standard truck into an amphibian by providing buoyancy through sealed empty tanks and a pair of small propellers for forward motion in water. Once on sand, it operated as a truck, capable of making 5.5 knots in a moderate sea and 50 miles per hour on land. It could carry artillery pieces, fighting men, or general cargo. Initially laughed at, it soon proved its worth and was adopted by the Army as the DUKW, D for 1942, the year of design, U for amphibian, K for all-wheel drive, W for dual rear axles. Production of landing craft was a major challenge. Building a fleet big enough to carry 3 to 5 divisions ashore in one day was immense. Neither the Navy nor the shipyards had experience in such matters, and competing priorities in 1942, escorts and merchant shipping, led to severe shortages. Churchill complained that the destinies of 2 great empires seemed tied up in some goddamn things called LSTs. Overcoming these shortages was a miracle of production and a triumph of the American economic system. The Navy and large shipyards were not interested in small boats, so the job fell to small businessmen and entrepreneurs. Among them, Andrew Jackson Higgins of New Orleans was the greatest designer and builder of landing craft. General Eisenhower once remarked that Higgins was the man who won the war for the Allies. Higgins had designed and built the LCVPs, which were crucial for landing over an open beach. Higgins was a self-taught genius in small boat design. In the 1930s, he had been building boats for the oil industry in Louisiana swamps. His Eureka boat met the need for a shallow draft vessel perfectly. Anticipating a war and a need for thousands of small boats, he bought the entire 1939 crop of mahogany from the Philippines for future use. When the Marines pressured the Navy to experiment with landing craft, Higgins entered the competition. Despite initial resistance from the Navy Bureau of Ships, Higgins managed to secure contracts, and the Marines loved his LCVPs. Higgins demonstrated that he was a genius at mass production as well as design. He employed up to 30,000 workers, creating the first integrated workforce in New Orleans. He inspired his workers as a general inspires troops, and his landing craft played a crucial role in the success of the Allied invasion. Hung over one of his assembly lines, the guy who relaxes is helping the Axis. He put pictures of Hitler, Mussolini, and Hirohito sitting on toilets in his factory's bathrooms. "Come on in, brother," the caption read. "Take it easy. Every minute you loaf here helps us plenty." He paid top wages regardless of sex or race. Higgins improved the design of the LCTs and produced hundreds of them. He helped design the patrol boats, PT boats, and built dozens of them. He had an important subcontractor role in the Manhattan Project and made other contributions to the war effort as well. Mostly, however, Higgins Industries built LCVPs. It was based on the Eureka design, but substituted a square bow, a ramp, for the spoonbill bow of the Eureka. At 36 feet long and 10.5 feet wide, it was a floating cigar box propelled by a protected propeller and powered by a diesel engine. It could carry a platoon of 36 men or a jeep and a squad of a dozen men. The ramp was metal, but the sides and square stern were plywood. Even in a moderate sea, it would bounce and shake while swells broke over the ramp and sides. But it could bring a rifle platoon to the shoreline and discharge the men in a matter of seconds, then extract itself and go back to the mothership for another load. It fit the need perfectly. By the end of the war, Higgins Industries had produced over 20,000 LCVPs. They were dubbed Higgins boats and carried infantry ashore in the Mediterranean, in France, at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and at other Pacific islands. More American fighting men went ashore in Higgins boats than in all other types of landing craft combined. The Higgins boats were carried across the Atlantic and later across the Channel on the decks of LSTs. They were lowered by davits. One of Higgins's arguments with the Bureau of Ships had been about length. He insisted that a 36-foot boat was the right length to meet the requirements, while the Navy said it had to be a 30-foot boat because the davits on the LSTs were designed for a boat of that length. "Change the davits!" Higgins thundered. Eventually, that common-sense solution was adopted. Together with the LCTs and other craft, they gave the Allies unprecedented mobility. The Allies had other advantages to help solve their problems. The Germans, who had been pioneers in creating a paratroop force, had given up on airborne operations after suffering disastrous losses in the 1941 capture of Crete. In any case, they did not have the transport capacity to mount much more than a small raiding party. But the American, British, and Canadian armies had airborne divisions and the planes to carry them behind enemy lines. Those planes were designated C-47S and dubbed DACs. Each could carry a stick of 18 paratroopers. The Dakota was the military version of the DC-3, a twin-engine plane built by Douglas Aircraft in the 1930s. It was unarmed and unarmoured, but it was versatile. It was slow, 230 miles per hour top speed, but the most dependable, rugged, and best-designed airplane ever built. A half-century and more later, most of the DC-3S built in the 30s were still in service, primarily flying as commercial transports over the mountains of South and Central America. The men the DACs carried were elite troops. There were 2 British airborne divisions, the 1st and 6th, and 2 American, the 82nd and 101st. Every paratrooper was a volunteer. Glider-borne infantry were not volunteers. Each paratrooper had gone through a rigorous training course as tough as any in the world. The experience had bonded them together. Their unit cohesion was outstanding. The men were superbly conditioned, highly motivated, and experts in small arms. The rifle companies in the Allied airborne divisions were as good as any in the world. So were the other elite Allied formations, such as the American Rangers and the British Commandos. The U.S. Army's infantry divisions were not elite by definition, but they had some outstanding characteristics. Although they were made up primarily of conscripted troops, there was a vast difference between American draftees and their German counterparts, not to mention the OST battalions. The American selective service system was just that, selective. 1/3 of the men called to service were rejected after physical examinations, making the average draftee brighter, healthier, and better educated than the average American. He was 26 years old, 5'8" inches tall, weighed 144 pounds, had a 33.5 inches chest and a 31 inches waist. After 13 weeks of basic training, he'd gained 7 pounds, converted many of his original pounds from fat to muscle, and added at least an inch to his chest. Nearly half the draftees were high school graduates. 1 in 10 had some college. As Geoffrey Perret puts it in his History of the U.S. Army in World War II, these were the best-educated enlisted men of any army in history. At the end of 1943, the U.S. Army was the greenest army in the world. Of the nearly 50 infantry, armoured and airborne divisions selected for participation in the campaign in northwest Europe, only 2, the 1st Infantry and the 82nd Airborne, had been in combat, nor had the bulk of the British Army seen action. Although Britain had been at war with Germany for 4 years, only a small number of divisions had been in combat, and none of those designated for the assault had more than a handful of veterans. This posed problems and caused apprehension, but it had a certain advantage. According to Karl, a veteran infantryman is a terrified infantryman. Sergeant Carwood Lipton of the 56th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne commented, "I took chances on D-Day I would never have taken later in the war." In wartime, Paul Fussell writes that men in combat go through 2 stages of rationalization, followed by one of perception. Considering the possibility of a severe wound or death, the average soldier's first rationalization is, "It can't happen to me. I am too clever, agile, alert, good-looking, beloved, etc." The second rationalization is, "It can happen to me, and I'd better be more careful. I can avoid the danger by watching more prudently, the way I take cover, dig, and expose my position by firing my weapon, keeping extra alert at all times, etc." Finally, the realization is, "It is going to happen to me, and only my not being there is going to prevent it." For a direct frontal assault on a prepared enemy position, men who have not seen what a bullet or a landmine or an exploding mortar round can do to a human body are preferable to men who have seen the carnage. Men in their late teens or early 20s have a feeling of invulnerability, as seen in the remark of Charles East of the 29th Division. Told by his commanding officer on the eve of D-Day that 9 out of 10 would become casualties in the ensuing campaign, East looked at the man to his left, then at the man to his right, and thought to himself, "You poor bastards." Men like Sergeant Lipton and Private East, and there were thousands of them in the American Army, could overcome the problem of inexperience with their zeal and daredevil attitude. The ordinary infantry divisions of the British Army were another matter. They had been in barracks since the British Expeditionary Force retreated from the continent in June 1940. The ordinary soldier was not as well educated or as physically fit as his American counterpart. Superficial discipline, dress, saluting, etc., was much better than among the GIs, but real discipline, taking and executing orders, was slack. The British War Office had been afraid to impose discipline too strictly in a democratic army, on the odd notion that it might dampen the fighting spirit of the men in the ranks. Those British soldiers who were veterans had been badly beaten by the Wehrmacht in 1940. Their overseas mates had surrendered to an inferior Japanese army in Singapore in February 1941, to an inferior German army in Tobruk, Libya, in June 1942, and again to an inferior German force on the Greek island of Leros in November 1943. The one British victory in the war, at El Alamein in November 1942, had been won over an undersupplied, outgunned Afrika Korps. In pursuing the defeated Afrika Korps into Tunisia, as in the ensuing campaigns in Sicily and Italy, the British Eighth Army had not displayed much of a killer instinct. The Germans who fought against the British often expressed their surprise at the way British troops would do only what was expected of them, no more. They found it remarkable that the British would abandon a pursuit to brew up their tea, and even more remarkable that British troops would surrender when their ammunition ran low, when their fuel ran out, or when they were encircled. General Bernard Montgomery, commander of the Eighth Army, wrote his superior, Chief of the Imperial General Staff Field Marshal Alan Brooke, "The trouble with our British lads is that they are not killers by nature." One reason for the shortcomings of the World War II British Army was inferior weaponry. British tanks, trucks, artillery and small arms were not as good as those of their enemies or of their American partners. Another reason was the way in which the poison of pacifism had eaten into the souls of British youth after the catastrophes of the Somme, Flanders and elsewhere in World War I. In addition, senior officers were survivors of the trenches. They had nightmares from the experience and mistrusted offensive action in general, and direct frontal assaults even more. What their generals had ordered them to do, charge across no man's land, They would not. They knew it was stupid, futile, and suicidal. Their mistake was in thinking that the lessons of World War I applied to all offensive action. On the eve of the invasion, General Montgomery visited D Company, the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, a glider-borne outfit in the 6th Airborne Division. Its commanding officer was Major John Howard. D Company had a special mission. It was composed of volunteers, had excellent junior officers, was well trained and primed to go. It was an outstanding rifle company. Montgomery's parting words to Howard were, "Bring back as many of the chaps as you can." Montgomery's approach to the launching of an offensive was markedly different from that of Field Marshal Douglas Haig in World War I, and certainly far more commendable. Yet those were strange words to say to the commander of an elite force undertaking an absolutely critical task. One might have thought something like, "John, whatever else, get the job done," would have been more appropriate. In part, Montgomery's caution was simple realism. Britain had reached her manpower limits. The British Army could not afford heavy losses, as there was no way to make them up. But it was precisely this point that infuriated Americans. In their view, the way to minimize casualties was to take risks to win the war as soon as possible, not to exercise caution in an offensive action. Something else irritated the Americans: the supercilious contempt for all things American that some British officers could not help displaying, and the assumed superiority of British techniques, methods, tactics, and leadership that almost all British officers shared, and many of them displayed. Officers regarded the Americans as novices in war, blessed with great equipment in massive quantities, and superbly conditioned, but with inexperienced enlisted men. Such officers felt it was their duty and destiny to train and teach the Americans. Field Marshal Sir Harold Alexander wrote to Brooke from Tunisia about the Americans. "They simply do not know their job as soldiers, and this is the case from the highest to the lowest, from the general to the private soldier. Perhaps the weakest link of all is the junior leader, who just does not lead, with the result that their men don't really fight." Another major problem the Allies faced at the end of 1943 was precisely the fact that they were allies. Napoleon once said, "Give me allies to fight against," pointing to an obvious truth. The Americans got on British nerves, and the British got on American nerves. This was exacerbated by proximity. As the American army in Britain began to grow in anticipation of the invasion, the friction increased. According to the British, the trouble with the Americans was that they were overpaid, oversexed, and overhear. The GIs responded that the trouble with the Brits was that they were underpaid, which was true, and undersexed, which tended to be true as British girls naturally gravitated to the GIs, who had money to throw around and were billeted in villages rather than segregated in isolated barracks. In Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy, the Tommies and the GIs had fought side by side, but there had been too much friction and too little functioning as a team. If they were going to penetrate the Atlantic Wall, they were going to have to learn to work together. One indication that they could do so was the designation of the force back in 1917, when members of the American Expeditionary Force were asked what A stood for. The Yanks replied, "After England failed." However, in 1943, A stood for Allied Expeditionary Force, as opposed to the untested, cocky, damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead American Army and the war-weary, too cautious British Army. The Germans could put into battle troops who, as described by Max Hastings, possessed an historic reputation as formidable soldiers. Under Hitler, their army attained its zenith. Hastings asserts that throughout World War II, wherever British or American troops met the Germans in anything like equal strength, the Germans prevailed. Hastings's judgment has become popular among military historians. A half-century after the war, the German soldier in World War II has assumed a mythical quality as the best fighting man not only in that war, but in almost any war ever fought. However, this judgment is wrong. The Wehrmacht had many fine units and outstanding soldiers, but they were not supermen. Even the WFF and SS elite troops of 1944 to 45 were not much, if any, better than ordinary Allied troops. Allied elite units, such as the airborne, Rangers and Commandos, were better than anything the Germans put into the field. What made the Germans look so good and so impressed Hastings and others was the kill ratio. It was almost 2, 1 in favour of the Wehrmacht, sometimes higher. But that criterion ignores a basic fact. The Wehrmacht versus the Anglo-American armies was almost always fighting on the defensive behind prepared positions or fixed fortifications such as the Mareth Line in Tunisia, the Winter Line in Italy, the Atlantic Wall in France, the West Wall in the final defence of Germany's borders. Even then, the Germans never managed to hold a position. They were always driven back. And, of course, the argument is that they were driven back by overwhelming firepower, that the Allies won because they outproduced the Germans, not because they outfought them. There is truth to that, but the only time in World War II that the Wehrmacht undertook a genuine offensive against American troops, it was soundly whipped. In the Ardennes, in December 1944, the Germans had the manpower and firepower advantage at Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne was encircled. It was almost a 10-to-1 advantage. Allied control of the air was useless for the first week of the battle due to miserable weather. The Germans were close to their supply dumps, and tanks rolling out of factories in the Rhineland could start firing almost as they left the factory gate. The Germans had some of their best Waffen-SS and Panzer divisions in the attack, ample artillery support, and yet the lightly armed 101st cut off from its supplies, cold, hungry, unable to properly care for its wounded, and running low on or out of ammunition, with little artillery support, held off desperate German attacks for more than a week. The American elite unit prevailed over the elite German units. Elsewhere in the Ardennes, the same pattern prevailed. Once they had recovered from their surprise, the American regular infantry units gave an excellent account of themselves. In 1980, Time magazine columnist Hugh Sidey asked General Maxwell Taylor, the wartime commander of the 101st Airborne, to assess the performance of the American soldiers under his command in World War II. There were many problems at first, Taylor said, but by December 1944 there were companies in his division that were better than anything anywhere. The men were hardened, the officers tested, their equipment upgraded, and they had that wonderful flexibility and self-confidence imparted by a democratic society. No other system could produce soldiers like that, but it did take some time. So although the German army contained some very good units, it would be inaccurate to call that army as a whole the best in the war. It would be more accurate to say that after 1941, the side on the defensive almost always gave a better account of itself. Neither were the Germans superior to the Allies on the technological front. True, their infantry weapons tended to be better, and they had some innovative gadgets such as the V-1 pilotless bomber and some genuine breakthroughs like the Snorkel submarine and the V-2 ballistic missile. But they had fallen badly behind in the quality and design of fighter and bomber aircraft. Except for the too late Me-262, they were not even in the atomic bomb race. Their encoding system, the Enigma machine, had been hopelessly compromised. Strangely enough, for a country that had Mercedes and Volkswagen, they were badly outclassed in motor transport. The British were outstanding in science and technology. The proximity fuse, radar and sonar were British innovations, as was penicillin. Much of the basic work on the atomic bomb was done by British physicists. The British were inventive. For example, they were working on special tanks called Hobart's Funnies, after Major General Percy Hobart of the 79th Armoured Division. In March 1943, Hobart was given the job of figuring out how to get armoured support onto and over the beaches to breach the concrete and minefields of the Atlantic Wall. He came up with swimming tanks, duplex drive, DD tanks, named after their twin propellers working off the main engine. They had a waterproof air-filled canvas screen around the hull, giving the DD the appearance of a baby carriage. The inflatable screen was dropped when the tank reached the shore. Another of Hobart's Funnies carried a 40-foot box girder bridge for crossing anti-tank ditches. The Crab had a rotating drum in front of the tank that thrashed the ground in front with steel chains, safely detonating mines in its path. There were others even more astonishing, such as the idea of towing prefabricated ports across the Channel. By the end of 1943, thousands of British workers were helping to construct the artificial ports, codenamed Mulberries, and the breakwaters to shelter them. The docks consisted of floating piers connected by treadways to the beach. The piers were devised so that the platform or roadway could slide up and down with the tide on 4 posts that rested on the seabed. The breakwater, codenamed Phoenix, combined hollow floating concrete caissons, about 6 stories high, with old merchant ships lined up end to end off the French coast. The ships and phoenixes were sunk by opening their seacocks, resulting in an instant port. The breakwater protecting instant port facilities was in place and ready to go on D-Day +1. There were many other British triumphs. One of the most important was Ultra. Ultra was the code name for the system of breaking the German Enigma encoding machine. From 1941 onward, the British were reading significant portions of German radio traffic, giving the Allies a generally accurate and occasionally exact and total picture of the enemy order of battle. This information was crucial in war, as it revealed where the enemy units were, their strength and their capabilities. Ultra provided the Allies with an immense advantage. When the Ultra secret was finally revealed in the early 1970s, people wondered why, if we were reading German radio traffic throughout the war, we didn't win sooner. The answer is that we did. The intelligence advantage was even greater thanks to the British double-cross system and German conceit. In 1940, the British managed to arrest all German spies in the United Kingdom. They were turned and persuaded at the point of a gun to operate as double agents for the next 3 years. They sent information to their controllers in Hamburg via Morse code, information carefully selected by the British. It was always accurate, as the aim of the operation was to build the German security services' trust in the agents. However, the information was either insignificant or too late to be of any use. Sometimes the information passed on could be disconcerting to the Allied forces preparing for the invasion. Sergeant Gordon Carson of the US 101st Airborne Division was stationed in Alorn, west of London, late in 1943. He liked to listen to Axis Sally on the radio. Sally, known to the men as the Voice of Berlin, was Mildred Gillers, an Ohio girl who had wanted to be an actress but had become a Parisian fashion model. There she met Max Otto Koenig, married him, and moved to Berlin. When the war came, she became a disc jockey. She was popular with the American troops because of her accent and her sweet, sexy voice, and because she played the latest hits interspersed with crude propaganda. Why fight for the communists? Why fight for the Jews? Etc. That gave the men a laugh, but they did not laugh when Sally interspersed her commentary with remarks that sent chills up the spines of her listeners. For example, "Hello to the men of Company E, 56th P 101st AB in Alorn. Hope you boys enjoyed your passes to London last weekend. Oh, by the way, please tell the town officials that the clock on the church is 3 minutes slow." Axis Sally had her facts straight, and hundreds of GIs and Tommies tell stories similar to Carson's about the clock. 50 years later, the veterans still shake their heads and wonder how she knew that. She knew because the double-cross system had given her the information. The receipt of so much information from their agents reinforced the German conceit that they had the best set of spies in the world. This, combined with their conviction that Enigma was the best encoding machine, absolutely unbreakable, made them think they had the best intelligence and counterintelligence systems in the world. Fooling the Germans about Allied capabilities and intentions was the negative side of the espionage struggle. The positive side was gathering information on the German order of battle. Of course, Ultra made a priceless contribution here. To supplement Ultra, the Allies had 2 additional sources ready for full action by the end of 1943. The first was air reconnaissance. With the Luftwaffe fighting defensively, mostly inside Germany, the Americans and British were free to fly over France and take all the photographs they wished. However, tank and artillery parks could be hidden in woods and field emplacements camouflaged. This brought into play the second Allied source, the French resistance. partly to keep the economy producing at full capacity, and partly because the German occupiers in France tried to act decently to make friends. French civilians were not evacuated from the coastal areas. They could see where the Germans were positioning their guns, hiding their tanks, and placing their mines. When the time came, they had ways of getting that information over to England, primarily by working with the Special Operations Executive, SOE, a part of the vast British intelligence-gathering covert operations network. It is far too simple to say that the marriage of British brains and American brawn sealed the fate of Nazi Germany in the West. The British contributed considerable brawn, and the Americans contributed considerable brains. Still, there is some truth in it. If the British miracles of World War II included Hobart's funnies, Ultra, and the double-cross system, the American miracles included the production of war material such as the world had never seen. At the beginning of 1939, American industry was still flat on its back. Factory output was less than half of capacity, and unemployment was above 20%. 5 years later, unemployment was 1%, while factory capacity had doubled, then doubled again, and yet again. In 1939, the United States produced 800 military airplanes. When President Franklin Roosevelt called for the production of 4,000 airplanes per month, people thought he was crazy. But by 1942, the United States was producing 4,000 a month, and by the end of 1943, 8,000 per month. There were similar, almost unbelievable great leaps forward in the production of tanks, ships, landing craft, rifles, and other weapons. All this took place while the United States put a major effort into the greatest industrial feat to that time, the production of atomic weapons. Hardly begun in 1942, it was completed by mid-1945. That a cross-channel attack against the Atlantic Wall could even be contemplated was a tribute to what Dwight Eisenhower called the fury of an aroused democracy. What made D-Day possible was the never-ending flow of weapons from American factories: Ultra, the double-cross system, victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, control of the air and sea, British inventiveness, the French resistance, the creation of citizen armies in the Western democracies, the persistence and genius of Andrew Higgins and other inventors and entrepreneurs, the cooperation of business, government, and labor in the United States and the United Kingdom, and more, all summed up in the single word, teamwork. The two men had much in common. Born in 1890, Dwight Eisenhower was 1 year older than Erwin Rommel. They grew up in small towns, Eisenhower in Abilene, Kansas, and Rommel in Gunz, Swabia. Eisenhower's father was a mechanic, Rommel's a schoolteacher. Both fathers were classic Germanic parents who imposed harsh discipline on their sons, enforced by physical punishment. Both boys were avid athletes. Eisenhower's sports were football and baseball. Rommel's were cycling, tennis, skating, rowing, and skiing. Although neither family had a military tradition, each boy went off to military school. In 1910, Rommel entered the Royal Officer Cadet School in Danzig, while Eisenhower, in 1911, went to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. As cadets, neither was an outstanding student, but both were competent and shared a proclivity for breaking the rules. Rommel wore a forbidden monocle, while Eisenhower smoked forbidden cigarettes. They were dashingly good-looking in their uniforms. Each courted and won the hand of a vivacious young beauty. In 1916, Rommel married Lucy Molen, and the next year Eisenhower married Mamie Dowd. Their careers diverged in World War I. Rommel was a combat leader in France and Italy, highly decorated with the Iron Cross First and Second Class and the coveted Pour le Mérite. Eisenhower was stuck in the States as a training commander, a bit of a blow to him from which he feared he would never recover. Still, as junior officers, both showed remarkable leadership ability. Theodor Werner, one of Rommel's platoon leaders, recalled, "When I first saw him in 1915, he was slightly built, almost schoolboys, inspired by a holy zeal, always eager and anxious to act. In some curious way, his spirit permeated the entire regiment right from the start. At first, barely perceptibly to most, but then increasingly dramatically, until everybody was inspired by his initiative, his courage, his dazzling acts of gallantry. His men idolized him and had boundless faith in him. Sergeant Major Claude Harris recalled of Eisenhower, "He was a strict disciplinarian, an inborn soldier, but most human and considerate. Despite his youth, he possessed a high understanding of organization. This principle built for him high admiration and loyalty from his officers, perhaps unequaled by few commanding officers." Lieutenant Ed Teer, one of Eisenhower's subordinates, wrote, "Our new captain, Eisenhower by name, is, I believe, one of the most efficient and best army officers in the country. He has given us wonderful bayonet drills. He gets the fellows' imaginations worked up and hollers and yells and makes us shout and stomp until we go tearing into the air." As if we meant business in the interwar years, RML remained a line officer while Eisenhower was a staff officer. Promotions were slow at best, but neither ever thought of any life other than that of a soldier. Even though each was ambitious and could have been a success in a number of civilian occupations, they impressed their superiors. RML's regimental commander wrote of him in 1934, "Head and shoulders above the average battalion commander in every respect." That same year, Eisenhower's superior, Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur, wrote, "This is the best officer in the Army. When the next war comes, he should go right to the top." The war brought both men out of obscurity. RML made his reputation first as commander of the Panzer Division that led the way through France in 1940. He added enormous luster to it and became a world figure as commander of the Africa Corps in the eastern North African desert in 1941–42. Eisenhower became a world figure in November 1942 in the western North African desert as commander of the Allied forces. Despite his spectacular victories in the desert, after RML lost the Battle of El Alamein in the late fall of 1942, he became what Hitler called a defeatist, what others would call a realist. On November 20th, when he learned that 45 out of 50 transport airplanes bringing fuel for his tanks had been shot down thanks to an ultra-intercept, RML went for a walk in the desert with one of his young battalion commanders, Major Baron Hans von Luck. "That's the end," the major recalled RML saying. "We can't even hold Tripolitania but must fall back on Tunisia. There, in addition, we shall come upon the Americans. Our proud Africa Army and the new divisions that have landed in northern Tunisia will be lost." Major Luck protested that they still had a chance. RML said no. As Luck recalled the conversation, RML said, "Supplies will not be forthcoming. Hitler's HQ has already written off this theatre of war. All he requires now is that the German soldier stands or dies. Luck, the war is lost." Despite his misgivings, RML fought on. The Americans, coming from the west, were waiting for the Africa Corps in Tunisia. There, in February 1943, Rommel and Eisenhower first clashed in the Battle of Kasserine Pass. Through surprise and audacity, Rommel scored impressive initial gains against the untried and inadequately trained American troops, who were led by untried and ill-prepared American generals, including Eisenhower, who was fighting his first real battle. Eisenhower made many mistakes but recovered from them, used his logistical and firepower superiority effectively, and eventually won the battle. By this time, Rommel was suffering from high blood pressure, while Eisenhower had violent headaches, nervous exhaustion, and rheumatism. Partly to preserve Rommel's health, partly to preserve his reputation, and partly to save himself from daily demands for more supplies for North Africa, Hitler ordered Rommel home after promoting him to field marshal. He spent most of the remainder of 1943 without a command. Eisenhower spent the remainder of 1943 commanding the assaults on Sicily and Italy. Both attacks were successful, but the campaigns that followed were disappointing. In Sicily, the American 7th Army, 5 divisions strong, and the British 8th Army, 4 divisions strong, took 5 weeks to drive 2 German divisions from the island. In Italy, progress was excruciatingly slow, and the Germans managed to impose a stalemate far south of Rome. Despite the disappointments and personal exhaustion, Eisenhower was consistently optimistic. He wrote to his wife, "When pressure mounts and strain increases, Everyone begins to show the weaknesses in his makeup. It is up to the commander to conceal his, above all, to conceal doubt, fear, and distrust. How well he was able to do so was indicated by a member of his staff who wrote from North Africa, "Eisenhower was a living dynamo of energy, good humor, an amazing memory for details, and amazing courage for the future. He made a study of leadership, which in his view was not an art but a skill to be learned. The one quality that can be developed by studious reflection and practice is the leadership of men," he declared. He wrote that it was at his first command post in Yalta in early November 1942 that he first realized how inexorably and inescapably strain and tension wear away at the leader's endurance, judgment, and confidence. No matter how bad things got, no matter how anxious the staff became, the commander had to preserve optimism in himself and in his command. Without confidence, enthusiasm, and optimism in the command, victory is scarcely obtainable. Eisenhower realized that optimism and pessimism are infectious, and they spread more rapidly from the head downward than in any other direction. He learned that a commander's optimism has a most extraordinary effect upon all with whom he comes in contact. With this clear realization, he firmly determined that his mannerisms and speech in public would always reflect the cheerful certainty of victory. Any pessimism and discouragement he might ever feel would be reserved for his pillow. Eisenhower never talked to a subordinate the way Rommel talked to Major Luck. Of course, Eisenhower had much more to be optimistic about, but there were other striking differences between the two men based as much on personality as on their positions. Rommel was impatient with the difficulties of logistics and administration, while Eisenhower, for almost 2 decades a staff officer, was a master at both. Rommel tended toward arrogance, while Eisenhower carefully cultivated an image of himself as a simple Kansas farm boy trying to do his best. Rommel did not like his Italian allies, and indeed hardly tried to hide his contempt for them, while Eisenhower had a genuine liking for his British allies, and did all he could to ensure smooth cooperation with them. Rommel often allowed his temper to flare with his staff, as did Eisenhower, and found it hard to delegate authority, an area in which Eisenhower was his exact opposite. Rommel was a loner, a solitary genius, a general who led by inspiration and intuition. Eisenhower was a team player, a manager of vast enterprises, a general who led by deciding what was the best plan after careful consultation with his staff and field commanders, then getting everyone behind the plan. On the battlefield, Rommel was an aggressive risk-taker. Eisenhower was a cautious calculator. Rommel won battles through brilliant maneuvering, Eisenhower by overwhelming the enemy. As Rommel always commanded forces that were inferior in numbers and firepower, his method was appropriate to his situation. As Eisenhower always commanded forces that were superior, so was his. Perhaps they would have acted differently had their situations been reversed, but that can be doubted. The way they exercised leadership fit their personalities. For all these differences, they had some remarkable similarities. Historian Martin Blumenson has written of Rommel, "If he demanded much from his men, he gave no less of himself. He worked hard, fought hard, lived simply, talked easily with his troops, and was devoted to his wife and son." Exactly those same words could be written about Eisenhower. Each general had a strong, happy marriage through the war years. Each man wrote regularly to his wife in the letters. They said things they said to no other person, revealed their hopes and apprehensions, complained about the small irritations of life, expressed a constant desire to get back together to enjoy a quiet domestic life, recalled incidents from the early years of their marriages, and in short, used the letter-writing moments as an opportunity to find some peace and quiet in the midst of the war raging all around them. Each general had one son. Manfred Rommel joined the Luftwaffe as an anti-aircraft gunner in early 1944, immediately after his 15th birthday, while John Eisenhower was a cadet at West Point who graduated on June 6, 1944, and went straight into the Army. Each son has had a successful career in a field different from his father's, Manfred as a politician, John as a writer of military history. Rommel and Eisenhower shared another fundamental trait. Each hated what the war made him do. They wanted to build, not destroy, to nurture life, not snuff it out. Destruction appalled them, construction delighted them. Rommel once said that when the war ended, he wanted to go to work as a hydraulic engineer, building water power generators all across Europe. His son, as mayor of Stuttgart, sponsored tremendous construction projects in that booming city in the 70s, 80s and 90s. With the St. Lawrence Seaway and the interstate highway system, Eisenhower, the president, became one of the great constructors in American history. Had he lived, Rommel might have played a similar role as Chancellor of West Germany. What we know about him leads to the thought that he might have been as popular a politician as Eisenhower proved to be. In late October 1943, General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations at Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, suggested to Hitler that Rommel be given tactical command in the West under Field Marshal Gunther von Rundstedt, who was Commander-in-Chief West. Rundstedt, Germany's senior serving Field Marshal at 69, was much too old to command in battle. He was short of energy and short of supplies, so although he had been charged with building an impregnable Atlantic wall, little had been done. Jodl's idea was that Rommel would provide the badly needed drive to get on with the work. Typically, Hitler temporized. He did not give Rommel tactical command for the invasion battle, but he did order him to make an inspection of the Atlantic Wall and report back to him. When he gave Rommel this news on November 5th, Hitler stressed the significance of the assignment. When the enemy invades in the West, it will be the moment of decision in this war, and the moment must turn to our advantage. We must ruthlessly extract every ounce of effort from Germany. Rommel spent the middle 2 weeks of December on his inspection tour, travelling from the North Sea to the Pyrenees Mountains. He was shocked by what he saw. He denounced the Atlantic Wall as a farce, a figment of Hitler's Vulcan Cook's Heim, an enormous bluff more for the German people than for the enemy, who, through his agents, knew more about it than the Germans did. Drawing on his experience in North Africa, Rommel told his chief engineer officer, General Wilhelm Meiser, that Allied control of the air would prevent the movement of German reinforcements to the battle area. "So our only possible chance will be at the beaches," he said. "That's where the enemy is always weakest. As a start on building a genuine Atlantic wall, I want anti-personnel mines, anti-tank mines, and paratroop mines. I want mines to sink ships and mines to sink landing craft. I want some minefields designed so that our infantry can cross them but no enemy tanks. I want mines that detonate when a wire is tripped, mines that explode when a wire is cut, mines that can be remote controlled, and mines that will blow up." When a beam of light is interrupted, Rommel predicted that the Allies would launch their invasion with aerial bombings, naval bombardments, and airborne assaults, followed by seaborne landings. No matter how many millions of mines were laid, he felt that the fixed defences could only hold up the assault, not turn it back. It would take a rapid counterattack on D-Day itself by mobile infantry and panzer divisions to do that. Thus, those units had to be moved close to the coast to be in position to deliver the decisive counterattack on this critical issue. Rounet disagreed. Rounet wanted to let the Allies move inland, then fight the decisive battle in the interior of France, well out of range of the heavy guns of the British and American battleships and cruisers. This fundamental disagreement would plague the German High Command right through to D-Day and beyond. Rounet and Rommel were offensive-minded generals, as were all Vermont-trained officers, but they were on the defensive now. German generals never learned to like it, although in a tactical sense they became proficient at it, as the Red Army could attest. In the strategic sense, they never learned the plain lesson the Red Army could have taught them had they studied Red Army strategy, that a flexible defense, which can give under pressure and strike back when the attacker is overextended, best suited the conditions of World War II. Rommel's report that Allied air power would make movement inland difficult, if not impossible, ignored Rounet's point that by fighting on the beach, the Germans would be putting themselves under the guns of the Allied fleet. Despite their disagreement, Rommel and Rounet got on well together, and were agreed that the attack would most likely come at the Pas de Calais. Rounet recommended that Rommel's Army Group B headquarters be given command of the 15th and 7th Armies, stretching from Holland to the Loire River in southern Brittany. Hitler agreed. On January 15, 1944, Rommel took up his new command at the end of November 1943. Roosevelt and Churchill, along with their staffs, went to Tehran, Iran, for a meeting with Stalin. The Soviet leader wanted to know about the Second Front. Roosevelt assured him that the invasion was definitely on for the spring of 1944 and had a code name selected by Churchill from a list kept by the British Chiefs of Staff, Overlord. Stalin demanded to know who was in command. Roosevelt replied that the appointment had not yet been made. Stalin said that in that case, he did not believe the Western Allies were serious about the operation. Roosevelt promised to make the selection in 3 or 4 days. Despite his promise, Roosevelt shrank from the distasteful task of making the decision. His preferred solution was Chief of Staff George Marshall for Overlord, with Eisenhower returning to Washington to become Chief of Staff of the Army. This had little to recommend it, as it would make Eisenhower Marshall's boss, an absurd situation, and worse, put Eisenhower in a position of giving orders to his old boss MacArthur, now commander in the Southwest Pacific Theater. Nevertheless, Roosevelt desperately wanted to give Marshall his opportunity to command in the field, the army he had raised, equipped, and trained. When the entourage arrived in Cairo, Egypt, in early December, Roosevelt asked Marshall to express his personal preference, hoping to make the decision for him. But Marshall replied that while he would gladly serve wherever the president told him to, he would not be the judge in his own case. Roosevelt reluctantly made his decision. As the last meeting at Cairo was breaking up, Roosevelt asked Marshall to write a message to Stalin for him. As Roosevelt dictated, Marshall wrote, "The immediate appointment of General Eisenhower to command of Overlord operation has been decided upon." Eisenhower got the most coveted command in the war by default, or so it seemed. In explaining his reasoning afterward, Roosevelt said that he just could not sleep at night with Marshall out of the country, since the commander had to be an American because the Americans were contributing 34% of the total force committed to Overlord. A process of elimination brought it down to Eisenhower, but there were manifold positive reasons for Eisenhower's selection. He had commanded 3 successful invasions, all of them joint operations involving British and American air, sea, and land forces. He got on well with the British, and they with him. General Montgomery, already selected as commander of the ground forces committed to Overlord, said of Eisenhower, "His real strength lies in his human qualities. He has the power of drawing the hearts of men towards him, as a magnet attracts a bit of metal. He merely has to smile at you, and you trust him at once." Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, the First Sea Lord, told Eisenhower it had been a great experience to serve under him in the Mediterranean. He had watched Eisenhower bring together the forces of 2 nations, made up of men with different upbringings, conflicting ideas on staff work, and apparently irreconcilable ideas, and forged them into a team. "I do not believe," Cunningham said, "that any other man than yourself could have done it." The key word was team. Eisenhower's emphasis on teamwork and his never-flagging insistence on working together were the single most important reasons for his selection. On December 7, 1943, Eisenhower met Roosevelt in Tunis, where the president was stopping on his way back to Washington. Roosevelt was taken off his plane and put in Eisenhower's car. As the automobile began to drive off, the president turned to the general and said almost casually, "Well, Ike, you are going to command Overlord." His title was Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. At Marshall's insistence, Eisenhower returned to the States for a 2-week furlough, followed by a series of briefings and meetings. He flew to Britain in mid-January, landing in Scotland and taking a train to London. On January 15, 1944, he took up his new command. When Eisenhower had first visited London in June 1942, there was a suite waiting for him at Claridge's, then London's best and most expensive hotel. But the liveried footmen were not to his taste, nor was the ornate lobby, and he found his suite with its black and gold sitting room and pink bedroom appalling. He moved to a less elegant hotel and had aides secure for him a quiet place in the country where he could relax. It was a small, modest two-bedroom house in Kingston, known as Telegraph Cottage. When Eisenhower returned to London in January 1944, he immediately complained that having Overlord headquarters in the city was distracting. Churchill, the American ambassador, and other VIPs felt free to call on him at any hour, and the staff found the temptations of London nightlife too much to pass up. Within 2 weeks, he moved the headquarters to Bushy Park outside the city. There, the staff, with considerable grumbling, moved into tents. Aides found a nearby mansion in Kingston Hill for his residence, but he found it much too grand. He asked about Telegraph Cottage and found that Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, his deputy supreme commander, was living there. He persuaded Tedder to switch residences, so the supreme commander thus had the least pretentious home of any general officer in England. When Rommel went to Paris at the beginning of January 1944 to meet with Rounet, who was living in considerable splendour in the Hotel Georges V, the city seemed to him like Babel. He wanted to establish his headquarters somewhere else. His naval aide, Vice Admiral Friedrich Roux, said he had just the place. On a trip back to Paris from the coast, Roux had stopped in at the Château de la Roche-Guyon, located on the Seine River in a village of 543 residents, some 60 kilometres downstream from Paris. The chateau had been the seat of the Duc de la Roche-Guyon for centuries. Thomas Jefferson had been a guest there in the late 18th century when he was American ambassador to France, and a friend of the most famous of the dukes, the writer François. Roux was an avid reader of La Roche-Guyon's maxims, and had called on the Duchess to pay his respects. Roux told Rommel the location was perfect, out of Paris, within equal distance of the 7th and 15th Army's headquarters, and the chateau was large enough to hold the staff. So the staff, with much grumbling, left Paris to set up headquarters in the sleepy village of La Roche-Guyon. Eisenhower wanted a dog for a companion. Aides found him a Scotty puppy he named Telk, a shortened form of Telegraph Cottage. Rommel wanted a dog for a companion too. Aides found him a duck-hunting puppy. The dogs slept in their respective masters' bedrooms. There were more meaningful comparisons. Each general jammed his feet into the stirrups, took hold of the reins, and galloped into action. Where there had been hesitation and drift, there was now conviction and movement. Their resolution was absolute. "I'm going to throw myself into this new job with everything I've got," Rommel wrote his wife, "and I'm going to see it turns out a success." Eisenhower said on arrival, "We are approaching a tremendous crisis with stakes incalculable." The generals set a pace that left other men in their early 50s panting and exhausted. They were typically on the road by 6 a.m. each day, inspecting, driving, training, preparing their men. They ate on the run, field rations or a sandwich and a cup of coffee, and did not return to their quarters until well after dark. Eisenhower averaged 4 hours of sleep per night, Rommel hardly more. One difference: Eisenhower smoked 4 packs of cigarettes a day, while Rommel never smoked. There were other significant differences. Although both men were full of resolve, the defender could not keep his doubts out of his mind, while the attacker refused to entertain any doubts. On January 17th, Rommel wrote his wife, "I think we're going to win the battle for the defence of the West for certain, provided we get enough time to set things up." For Eisenhower, there were no provides, only challenges. On January 23rd, he told his superiors on the Combined Chiefs of Staff, CCS, "Every obstacle must be overcome, every inconvenience suffered, and every risk run to ensure that our blow is decisive. We cannot afford to fail." One fact in Rommel's pessimism was the confused command structure. For all their prattling about the Führer principle of ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, one people, one state, one leader, the Nazis ran the armed services as they ran the government, by the principle of divide and rule. Hitler deliberately mixed the lines of authority so that no one ever knew precisely who was in command of what. This characteristic of the Führer principle was exacerbated by the natural and universal tendency of air, sea, and ground forces to indulge in inter-service rivalry. In Rommel's case, he did not have control over the Luftwaffe in France, nor of the navy, nor of the administrative governors.